Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be doing something a little bit different to what I would normally build, in the form of the 1/72nd scale Sukhoi Su-50 from Zvezda. Now at this stage I do want to point out that I bought this one secondhand from a friend of mine who'd probably brought it back around about 2011, 2012, judging by the age of the box. So that means it was probably brought a fair while before the situation that is currently going on with this kit's country has occurred. Now, I also refer to this kit as the Su-57 Felon, which I believe is accurate, even though this is technically the Su or T-50, which is the prototype, but I don't believe the aircraft has undergone any major visual changes, so I think it's still appropriate, but if I'm wrong, let me know in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's get into building this one. To begin with, I gave all of the sprues a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue that might be on them from the moulding process, which could prevent paint or glue from adhering to the model. I then began assembly with the cockpit. I cut out the main cockpit tub, followed by the ejector seat and its various extra parts, the instrument panel, and some small controls for the sidewalls and the control column. I used a knife to carefully scrape off any excess sprue and assembled the rather fiddly little ejection seat. I added the control column and the throttle controls to the cockpit, followed by the main instrument panel, although I would later move this to the top fuselage half. I switched to assembling the engine intakes while the cockpit parts bonded, and after cutting the intake parts out, I cleaned them up and then glued them together. Admittedly, I was a little bit lazy with not painting the interior for the air intakes, but they were already quite a dark colour with the grey plastic. I then moved on to cutting out both the first set of fan blades and a square piece that makes up part of the main landing gear, which was also glued to the air intakes. I repeated this assembly for the other side, and then cut out the underside fuselage half, which also contains the wings. The attachment points were cleaned up using a knife, and then I cut out and added in a small part for the air intake, followed by the main air inlet. I also cut out the upper fuselage half and repositioned the instrument panel so that it was attached to the glare shield on the second fuselage half, rather than attached to the cockpit tub, just to make it a little bit easier to line things up later on. I painted the fan blades and the interior exhaust parts with Tamiya X31 titanium gold, and painted some of their details along with some small grille parts for the exhaust with Vallejo oily steel based on reference photos. I struggled a bit with selecting the interior colour, but in the end I decided to go with Vallejo's Model Air AMT7. This may have been a little bit too blue for the Su-57's cockpit, but it seemed like a close enough match for what I had. Another coat of oily steel and Titan gold was applied to the engine, and then I painted the entire ejection seat with Vallejo flat black. To make the layers less transparent and more uniform, I applied several coats of the AMT7 in the cockpit, and also several coats of the flat black on the ejection seat. Some additional details on the engine were picked out using XF24 dark grey, and then carefully neatened up with some X31. I painted the padding for the seat with XF51 khaki drab, and after giving the cockpit a third coat of the AMT7, I got out some enamel-based Tamiya black panel liner scent and applied it onto all of the engine parts to make them a little bit darker and give them a weathered effect, highlighting their details. Another coat of khaki drab was applied to the seat, followed by some Vallejo vermilion red, which was painted onto the ejection handles. The control column was painted flat black, before painting some of the raised details on the control column with vermilion red, and then painting the seat belts with some XF80 from Tamiya. The seat was then glued to the cockpit floor, and I glued the engine details to the air intakes. The entire air intake system was then assembled to the lower fuselage, taking care to line up all of the parts correctly so that there was no gap between the inlets, and so that all of the moulded details for the landing gear bay were lined up correctly. The glare shield was painted flat black, and once that had dried, I glued the cockpit tub to the upper fuselage half. After a few more touch-ups with the flat black and AMT7, I then got out the decals, which seemed to be in good condition, and cut out the instrument panel and sidewall decals. These were then stuck in some water, and after the decals started to come loose of the paper, I applied them into the cockpit. To help the decals further conform to the surface, I then applied some Tamiya decal adhesive, and then I glued the interior for the engine exhaust to the lower fuselage half. Finally, I then joined both the upper and lower halves together, and then added on the control surfaces after they'd been cleaned up. Unfortunately, because of the way these sprues are moulded, the detail on the sides of the aircraft fuselage aren't very nice and crisp, although fortunately the ones on the upper and lower surfaces are. I cut out and cleaned up the nose wheel tyres and then glued them to their strut, before then adding these parts to the fuselage. The nose wheel assembly was overall pretty simple, with some nice details and a pretty good fit. There are 4 separate parts included for the nose wheel's doors, which I then glued into place after the nose wheel had been added. The main landing gear struts were a bit more fiddly, but still came together quite well, and after the 2 main struts were added to the fuselage, I then added the main wheel doors, cleaned up each of the wheels, and then glued them to their struts. Unusually for a model kit with tricycle undercarriage, the Felon didn't actually require any nose weight, which was quite convenient. The last larger piece to add to the kit before I moved on to painting was the nozzles for the exhaust, which were first cleaned up and then installed. I assembled the included stepladder at this stage, along with the very nicely detailed crew figures, which include a pilot for both the cockpit and an alternative one holding his helmet and standing by his plane as though he's waiting on the ground. I really love the inclusion of the crew and ladder, and really wish more manufacturers of model kits did this for their modern kits. Although the fit of the parts was reasonably accurate, I did still fill in a few gaps using some Vallejo water-based putty, and once the putty had dried, I then sanded away the excess. This was mainly on the leading edges of the wings, and also around the horizontal stabilizers. Only one scheme is included in this kit, and fortunately for me, it's the same camouflage pattern as the aircraft used in Top Gun Maverick. I'd never done this scheme before, and the colour guide wasn't particularly useful, so I decided to do a few tests with the various colours I had to determine the closest I could match with. In the end, I decided to go with Vallejo's Model Air Insignia White, along with XF53 and XF63 for the 2 darker colours. As usual, I started painting with the lightest colour, which in this case was Insignia White. I thinned down the paint by mixing it with a little bit of water after it was squeezed out of the bottle, and then I applied it over the model, as much as possible trying to go from nose to tail in the same direction to help reduce any brush strokes. With brush painting, you want to keep your paint layers nice and thin, and build them up in several layers rather than doing any thicker ones to avoid filling in any recessed details and creating visible streaks. After I did the second coat of Insignia White, I then decided to add the second lightest colour, which was XF53 Neutral Grey. This time I thinned the paint down with some water and applied it only in the areas where the camouflage would be present. I tried to outline the shapes for each pattern, keeping my brush as straight as possible and then filling in the larger shapes after I have the outlines. In some areas I used a smaller brush to try and get a bit more accuracy with my lines. Once the neutral grey dried, I then applied the third and darkest colour, which was XF63 German Grey. Again, I did the outlines for each shape and then carefully filled it in, aiming to keep the paint nice and thin. I did consider doing a few more coats of the lighter XF53 before adding the darker XF63, but I figured it would be a bit easier to fix up any excess XF63 before adding too many other layers. I didn't realise until actually painting this scheme that the upper and lower surfaces seem to be an identical mirror of each other. I'm assuming the idea behind this is to confuse the hell out of anyone dogfighting this plane by making it hard to tell which way it's facing, which I thought was a pretty cool feature. Once the XF63 was dried, I then applied a third coat of the Insignia White, this time carefully filling in each of the white areas and neatening up any mistakes I'd made with the XF53 and 63. This process was then repeated with a second coat of XF53 followed by XF63. I did consider using Tamiya masking tape, but in my experience with brush painting it tends to still bleed and also has a nasty habit of tearing off the paint it's attached to, so I decided for this one to just stick to eyeballing it. Admittedly, someone with an airbrush who knows how to use it could get a much more fantastic result, but I still feel like I got a pretty decent one thanks to using thin layers and carefully neatening up mistakes if I made any. I did a fourth coat of the Insignia White, along with a third coat for the XF53 and 63, and then repainted any areas of the cockpit with AMT7 which had accidentally been painted over. I struggled to find a colour for the wheel wells, but in the end I decided to go with AK Interactive's RLM76 late war version based on reference photos. I applied several coats of this colour for the inside of the landing gear bay and also on the wheel well doors. The tyres were then painted Vallejo flat black, and after a few coats, I then painted the landing gear struts themselves with Tamiya X1 Gloss Black. I did this build a few months ago, and this was actually before I started applying gloss coats regularly before adding decals. Luckily for me though, the decals for this kit went on easily without any silvering, and were of pretty good quality. The scheme includes the blue 51 for the nose, along with quite a lot of nicely detailed smaller stencils, and some low visibility red stars for the wings and the tail. Once in place, the decals received some Vallejo decal softener to help them soften to the surface details, and some Tamiya decal adhesive was then applied over the top of them to help them further conform to the model. And while that dried, I continued to carefully paint the landing gear details using some Vallejo silver for the unpainted struts and for the wheel hubs. I painted the clear head-up display piece with Tamiya X25 clear green and XF63 for the canopy frames. I'd usually use Rocket Odorless CA glue to glue clear parts to the model because this glue doesn't fog up any of the clear parts, but unfortunately I was out of it at the time, so I had to carefully use some Revell Contactor Professional, which was applied to a stick to help apply it onto the clear parts more accurately. The various small antennas and pitot tubes were glued into place, and once all of them were in place, I then painted them their appropriate camouflage colour. I decided to leave the rear canopy off, however, so that I could open and close it to put the pilot in or take him out. I then gave the aircraft a coat of Vallejo water-based semi-gloss varnish to give it a slightly more shiny finish than the matte paint which had been used, and also to protect the decals and blend them into the paint job. Some Vallejo silver and X1 gloss black was used to paint the various antennas on the aircraft, and then I used a tiny bit of gloss varnish on a small brush to apply onto the instrument decals to make them look a little bit shiny. With the camouflage and the varnish done, I then moved on to painting the engine exhaust section at the rear of the aircraft. For this, I started with 2 coats of X31, which was applied over the entire section. Once the second coat had dried, I then applied some X33 bronze to the nozzle and a stripe closer to the front. Further details were then picked out using Vallejo natural steel and oily steel based on various reference photos. I carefully neatened up any mistakes I'd made when painting the exhausts with some XF53 and a fine brush, and with the colours finished, I then applied a thick coat of Tamiya black panel liner scent, and then let it dry to create a dark and burnt effect to the entire area. The panel liner was then also applied along the various edges of all the control surfaces, around the access hatches on the aircraft, and in a streaking motion around various hatches and the wheel wells and weapons bay. This was to create a build-up of some grime, as well as to create a post-shading effect in certain areas. Once the panel liner dried, I then used some X20 enamel thinners applied to a cotton bud to rub away any excess panel liner from the areas I didn't want it, and also to streak it backwards to create a soft streaking effect. Eventually, I thin and streak the panel liner to a level I am happy with, and after repeating this process with a few other spots based on reference photos, I then moved on to the pilot figures. I started painting the pilots first with their main uniform colour, which I decided to use Vallejo Russian Uniform Green for, and then I followed it up with some Vallejo 70927 Dark Flesh as a base skin colour, Vallejo Flat White for their helmets, XF53 Neutral Grey for their oxygen hoses, Vallejo Flat Black for their boots, and a second coat of white, and for a lighter skin highlight I used some Vallejo 70845 Sunny Flesh. A second coat of Russian green was applied to their uniform, and then I painted their oxygen masks AMT7. XF82 Ocean Grey was used as a darker grey for their gloves, while I painted the seated pilot's straps XF83. I used some X1 Gloss Black to paint the visor on their helmets, and after it had dried I then applied some white to fix up any mistakes I'd made when painting the visor. XF51 Khaki Drab was used to pick out some markings on the pilot's collars, and for the seated pilot I then used Vallejo Model Colour Silver for the harness buckles. Finally, I painted a tiny bit of white for the standing pilot's shirt under his uniform and gave him some brown hair. To highlight their details, I then applied some Tamiya black panel liner scent over the figures, and while it dried I painted the latter with several coats of Vallejo Flat Yellow. I then used X20 enamel thinners once again to remove the excess panel liner from the pilots, and to help it flow more into only of the recessed details using a capillary effect. The latter received several more coats of flat yellow, which, much like white, is a rather tricky colour to brush paint without accidentally going too thick due to the lighter colours being somewhat transparent when painted onto a surface. I then painted the last bit of detail on the landing lights of the aircraft using Vallejo Model Air RLM01 Silver, and I gave the ladder some metal chipping using XF16 flat aluminium. Finally, I used some crystal clear to glue the landing light covers onto the nose wheel landing lights, and with that, the Zvezda Su-57 Felon was finally completed. And here you can see the final results I was able to achieve with this kit. And on the whole, I have to say it goes together really well, despite the sprue attachment points requiring a bit of effort to clean up on some of the parts. And although the surface details in some areas, especially on the fuselage sides, are a bit soft and faded in some areas due to the way the kit is moulded, on the whole the details seem to be pretty good and the shaping seems quite accurate. The decals are also very good, assembly is pretty simple, the fit of the parts is pretty good, and I think they've done a really good job with the clear parts, considering how much they curve. I also absolutely love the boarding ladder and the crew figures, and I really wish more model kit companies would include at least a pilot, but options for ground crew or pilots on the ground like this are even more special, so that's a big plus for this kit. I'm quite pleased with the results I was able to achieve, especially with only using the enamel washes for the weathering, which kept it nice and restrained. I'm really happy with how the camouflage turned out as well, although I probably could have thinned the white a little bit more and done a few more layers, since it is a bit thick in some places. The shapes are a bit off if you look really closely, but as I've mentioned, my experience with masking tape is not very good, so I was reluctant to use it, and I'm sure one day once I've sorted out a place to have an airbrush and learnt how to use it, I will be able to get much better results, but I'm still pretty happy, as I've said, with what I was able to achieve. Now, I don't usually like to mix politics with model making, since I like to focus on the build and enjoying the hobby, but given that this kit was made by Zvezda, I know some people might have some concerns, which is completely understandable. I picked this one up secondhand though, so it had already been out in the world, and the suppliers and manufacturer had most likely been paid long before things became as complicated as they are now. I won't be buying any new Zvezda kits given the situation, although I'm not opposed to buying them secondhand or if they're already in a hobby shop within Australia, but if someone chooses to avoid certain brands, totally, that's definitely their decision and I respect that fully. If it weren't for the actions of the country that this kit's manufacturer had come from, then I would definitely recommend this kit, given that it goes together pretty well, has some nice details, and has some very nice features such as the inclusion of crew figures. So this pretty much wraps up my build video for the Zvezda Su-50/Su-57. I do hope you enjoyed it, and a massive thanks to everyone for liking and subscribing to help support the channel, and also a big thanks to my wonderful patrons who helped me fund buying these kits, and also the products that I use to make them. If you've got any questions or constructive criticism, please leave it down in the comments section below, but I do ask that people keep their comments nice and polite, as not everyone's at the same level with model making, and I don't really claim to be an expert. I really just enjoy building kits, and I hope that by sharing my videos I can help people avoid making certain mistakes, and also learning from my successes. Otherwise though, thanks again for watching, and of course, until the next video, take care, and as always, model on.